Liz is adoption manager at DataSite. She's going to be talking about assessing contribution and value. So thank you, Liz, and off to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Lorraine's talk is actually a very good segue into what I'll be talking about. And sorry about that. Let me just share. So and Todd, your questions were actually a great segue as well. At DataSite, we actually do quite a bit of work around aggregating usage statistics from repositories that report based on a variation of the counter code of practice that is the counter code of practice for research data, but it's largely similar. All righty. So in my presentation, we'll be continuing on with assessing contribution and value, but with a perspective, a more holistic perspective, perhaps. So I work at DataSite, as Todd mentioned. I also work with the research organization registry project, and I previously worked at ORCID, so a lot of persistent identifier work over the past decade. And I'm going to be talking about considering the impacts of the monograph in terms of not only the monograph itself and looking at its usage and impact across potentially multiple repositories and places it might live, but also the inputs that go into creating a monograph and other sorts of impact usage of those resources and resources that might be generated based on the monograph. So I do work a lot with persistent identifiers. So warning, I have the persistent identifier bent that persistent identifiers can solve all problems, but of course I understand that things in the real world might be a little different than the perfect persistent identifier universe portrays them as. That I am a librarian by training and started in digital archival collections. So I have a pretty strong understanding of a lot of challenges that we deal with in the digital context. But step back for a minute. You might be wondering, so I am not from the scholarly publishing world specifically. I don't work with specifically with monographs all day, every day on a daily basis. And you might be wondering, why on earth is DataSite here? This is supposed to be about humanities and monographs. DataSite works a lot with scientific communities and data sets. What is this about? So I'm here to hopefully convince you that DOIs, digital object identifiers, which of course DataSite is a DOI registration agency, and other persistent identifiers like organization identifiers and person identifiers like ORCID IDs are an important part of the digital scholarly infrastructure that includes all types of resources and outputs in all disciplines. And that persistent identifiers like DOIs, ORCID IDs, and ROR identifiers can increase discovery, access, citation, reuse, and recognition of not only monographs themselves, but of all the resources that support monograph creation. And of course, all those different pieces of the puzzle, the discovery, the access, the citation, reuse signify value. I hope I can convince you that adoption and use of persistent identifiers by humanities scholars and publishers and digital collections that help to support scholarship make contributions of both scholars and collections more visible and more valuable to institutions, funders, readers, and other stakeholders. So that's the kind of the premise about why I'm here. I will warn you that because I come from the persistent identifier world, I do come with a little bit of jargon in tow. So before I start talking more about monographs, we'll just clarify some of that jargon. if you're not familiar about what a persistent identifier or a PID is, it is basically a special URL that's registered in a known system, like the Digital Object Identifier System or ORCID or ROR. So the example you see on the left, of course, is a DOI, happens to be a DataCite DOI. So when one of those special persistent identifier URLs, when you type that into a browser address bar or click on it, it does not go directly to a page on the web right away. It gets ground through the gears of that persistent identifier system that decides where exactly you should be pointed to. You may be pointed to the resource itself or some metadata representation of it. The key here is that it results hopefully in URLs that don't break over time. So that DOI or that ORCID ID or that ROR ID always points to the correct thing that you are looking for. So why do they exist? Of course, the primary technical challenge we're trying to solve is that that link rot kind of problem over time, and that's particularly relevant in scholarship and publishing. If you find a citation to a particular resource and you click on it, you want to be able to find that thing 5 or 10 years down the road. And of course, that is a big challenge with URLs to resources. So persistent identifiers allow citation, so accurate attribution. They allow disambiguation, so citing a very specific resource, whether that be a person, a place, or a thing. So those are the technical aspects, but the other magical property of persistent identifiers, because they are typically or almost always backed by a metadata record, is that they enable discovery, visibility, and automation. So with that jargon out of the way, we can take a look at what I'm framing as the interconnected monograph. So the kind of PIDified monograph and the advantages that it affords. So I have here as an example, and of course, very randomly selected monograph as an example. So this particular book is authored by a handful of researchers at universities in Sweden and Argentina. It is a history of Swedish polar exploration. So it is based on a number of archival materials, but also the team went to a historic polar research station and did some field work to look at the state of that research station currently. So there are some new materials that they've generated as well that form the basis of this book. So the book, of course, has ISBNs. It has some other identifiers. That's all delightful and very nice. But readers of this book will find that the team that authored this book also created a lot of other materials in the course of their work. So they have materials like photographs, sketches, laser scans, all sorts of other items, which they have delightfully uploaded to a data repository. So readers of this book can go and find all of those source materials in this repository. It's the Swedish National Data Service. So right from the book, of course, the electronic version of this book. Oops. They can get to the repository and also get to these items themselves. So again, not what we typically think of as, or not what many people typically think of as data, photographs and sketches and other non-number sorts of materials, but from the data citation side of things, we certainly consider these sorts of materials data. Now, if we look at an individual record for one of these data sets, which in this case is a collection of sketches from the Polar Research Station field site, we can get even more information and context. The first important thing that we see is we can download it and we can figure out how to cite it in our own work if we want to reuse it. And that's a really important aspect for contribution and value. So not just the monograph itself, but how can we enable people to reuse additional resources that are going into monographs. And when citing these sorts of resources, it's for a variety of reasons, it's advantageous to use DOIs to cite this. So of course, using DOIs to cite resources not only ensures that those links won't break over time, but as we see when we look at the metadata side of things, it allows us to count usage of those resources and aggregate usage together across different repositories. In this dataset record, we can also get a lot more contextual information about the researchers, their institutions, others who contributed to this work, funding agencies that contributed to this work. So sort of a full picture of what went into the production that resulted in this book. So that's great news for the consumer of a monograph. I can find when the researchers register their underlying resources in a repository, I can reuse them, I can cite them, I can find out more information about the work. That's all great. But when it comes to the other side of this on assessing the contributions and the value and getting a more full picture of the context of a book, that's where the underlying metadata comes into play. So we can see how this works a little bit based just on the fact that I was able to find this particular book. So how did I find this monograph and its related data? How did I know there was a book with a particular ISBN that had a bunch of underlying data resources and also ORCID IDs associated with it? So I did not read this book. Funders, deans of research, librarians, they may not read the book either. I used metadata. So I used DOI metadata in this case to find out about not only the ISBN of this book, but also the resources that were related to the ISBN of this book. So some background on DOI records and DataCite DOI records in particular. They support a huge amount of metadata about the raw resources, so data sets. Things like authors and their ORCID IDs, organizations that authors are affiliated with, funding organizations and their identifiers, and also resources that are related. So for example, books, book chapters, journal articles that resulted from a particular data set or resource. And that's really where the power in terms of assessment and aggregating usage lies. So our metadata at DataCite, and this goes for other persistent identifiers like ORCID and Crossref DOIs and ROR identifiers. So it's all machine readable. Any system that wants to consume our metadata, we're completely open, can do it. So they can find things like researchers and their affiliations and their ORCID IDs. We can, for systems who are consuming metadata, they can find the related ROR IDs, and systems that are indexing DataCite and other DOI metadata can find these connections to, for example, books like the ISBN for the book example that I showed, and make those connections between the book, the authors, the organizations, the data resources, the inputs. So what does that mean? Why is that useful? Well, that means that I, as the institution or a funder or a library, can get insights about impact and usage from another slightly different perspective. So as a research institution, I or more likely the tools that I use can gather together all of the different outputs from my institution wherever they might live. So the metadata about those outputs, including aggregating together usage statistics. The example I'm showing here is from a tool that we run called DataCite Commons that aggregates together DOI metadata and usage statistics into one platform. So this is kind of a user interface based example, but really what goes on behind the scenes is that for both DataCite and Crossref, so two major DOI registration agencies, as well as ORCID, we are aggregated sources of metadata that lots and lots of indexing services and analytics platforms use, because they are a one-stop shop for not only metadata, but usage information about different types of resources. So no need for visiting every single repository and source. Those CRIS systems and analytics tools can go to persistent identifier services and pull in metadata from there. So aggregation is one powerful feature of persistent identifier metadata. Additionally, integration between persistent identifier services that allow data to flow through different systems and services and scholarly communication, making connections and making usage data and resource metadata discoverable across different tools and services, and also reducing the manual work of data entry and data collection. So that's kind of the vision of the interconnected monograph, the pitified monograph that allows us to get a more full picture of the inputs and outputs and connected organizations, individuals, funding. So that sounds interesting, probably a useful direction, but what's needed to enable that, to make that happen? So I have a couple of takeaways and actions. First, I want to say persistent identifiers are for everyone, all disciplines, all resource types. There's kind of a perception and a misnomer that DOIs particularly are just for publications, or DataCite DOIs are just for science, just for numbers coming out of a particle accelerator. So I'm here to say that's not the case. DOIs are from a system that has a very specific technical purpose. They are unique identifiers and persistent URLs, not status symbols for publication. They are designed to solve this challenge of citability, discoverability across all kinds of different resources. Secondly, data is all inclusive. This includes all sorts of materials that humanities scholars commonly produce. Anything that goes into a spreadsheet is data. Audio files, videos, interactive resources, photographs, images, collections of images, collections of text, whether it might be translated, analyzed, whatever, databases. Those are all things that, at least from our perspective at DataCite, we consider that data and something that is a worthy scholarly output that is valuable to the community. So with that in mind, you might wonder, can I register a DOI for whatever I might have for my my text file collection that I've analyzed, or my image set, or my audio recordings? From a DataCite perspective, yes, we support a huge range of material types, including audiovisual resources, collections, physical objects, sound, interactive resources. And yes, we do support registration of DOIs for books and book chapters, as does Crossref. This is actually relatively new. We previously just had one type that was for text, but now we have quite a lot more interest in registration of DOIs for specific types of text objects, particularly from digital publishing platforms that are used to create ebooks. So yes, you can register a DOI for that in most cases. So for the scholars who are out working, creating monographs, I have a couple of suggested action steps, and these are things that that organizations, both publishers and libraries, can actively support as well. So four steps: deposit your data in a repository, data broadly speaking, fill out the metadata completely, cite your data in publications using DOIs, and add all of those works to ORCID to maximize the visibility of your work. Now, we looked at the Swedish National Data Service, and of course, not everybody is at an institution that has access to a repository that can handle their materials. And this is particularly true in humanities, because repositories may be willing to accept text files, PDFs, smaller file sizes, and uncomplicated objects. But there are options even if you don't have that locally at your institution. There are generalist repositories out there that accept a wide range of file types and sizes, and they do register DOIs, and they're free. So this example that I'm showing here is from Zenodo. This is a database of audio files that was also used and cited in later in a book. So advantages here, we can see it's connected up with the author's ORCID ID. We get some usage statistics from this particular repository, which are then aggregated into the vast soup of DataCite metadata. So when indexers and analytics platforms are coming through, they also can get this same usage stats info from DataCite directly. And then we can also see that we have a book that is related to this data set. So nice features in those generalist platforms that are useful not just for hard sciences, but for humanities scholars as well. So when depositing resources in a repository, it's really, really important that metadata is completed fully. That's really what enables connections and makes your work more visible to the whole world and to these indexing platforms and analytics and CRIS systems that consume DOI metadata. So filling out things like affiliations and ORCID IDs, grant information, related book chapters, journal articles, and books, as well as information about contributors, is extremely helpful in making the work more visible. It's of course great to upload your supporting resources to a repository, make them visible to other people and reusable, but it's equally important to actually cite those things in your work. So when preparing manuscripts, cite them using the DOI that was generated, so the citations can more easily be counted and usage can be counted. Zenodo and other generalist repositories offer citation formatters, which are extremely handy and let you cite in a variety of formats. DataCite also runs a service in collaboration with Crossref that will generate citations from a DOI that you can use in your publications. Finally, adding works to ORCID makes them visible to all of the different services and people that consume data from ORCID. So it's possible to, of course, add works based on DOIs from Crossref and DataCite. There are search and link wizards that allow you not only to import works on a one-time basis into your ORCID record, but can also automatically update your ORCID record with new items as they are generated. You can also import works from MLA, International Bibliography, Scopus, and several other regional resources. ORCID unfortunately doesn't have an ISBN import wizard yet. However, books can be manually entered using their ISBN in the ORCID interface. So on the flip side, for organizations, institutions and libraries, and also publishers, there are some corresponding recommendations. So institutions that have repositories, digital collections, digital archival content, registering DOIs is a great way to improve citability and visibility for your content. Libraries can also spread the word on their campus, particularly to humanities scholars, about research data management and improving the visibility of their content and contributions. There are some great resources from the DORIA project, particularly, that I would recommend. And I know that a lot of libraries are already out there doing this kind of work, writing up LibGuides and holding workshops. Those are great things. For publishers, this is starting to happen. We're starting to see this more and more with digital publishing platforms, but incorporating persistent IDs into workflows for books. So ORCID IDs for authors. There was a working group a couple of years ago that ORCID ran that produced a set of recommendations for ORCID IDs in books workflows. Organization IDs like ROAR for author affiliations, which I just came from a meeting where we were discussing that. There are a number of publishers who are incorporating ROAR identifiers and as an open ID alternative to some of the closed systems. And of course, we're starting to see more DOI registration for books from some of the ebook production systems, Open Monograph Press, Ubiquity, Pressbooks. So this persistent identifier stuff, it's kind of weird, sounds like a lot of work. Plus, we still have to write, edit, submit, edit some more, format, publish, and distribute that monograph. So yes, it is additional work. I can't debate that. Uploading resources to a repository, making sure you filled out all that metadata correctly. Yes, it's a lot of additional work. Publishing a monograph is a lot of work. And I'd suggest that we might as well then maximize the effort of all that work by making the inputs and the monograph as visible, connected, and reusable as possible. So I have some resources in my slides if you'd like to learn more about anything that I've talked about, but otherwise I will wrap it up and take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Liz. There's a great question here from Charles Watkinson, who will be speaking later, about publishers' operations and kind of the scalability. How should publishers work in this environment where book authors kind of want the kind of brand recognition that comes along with Crossref, and that is associated with narrative books, journals, etc. Whereas there's a perception that DataCite is connected to data objects, and it's that, and this is Charles speaking, it sounds like a lot of work and cost for the publisher. Are there ways that this can be streamlined? Are there clear lines when Crossref is the appropriate, DataCite is the appropriate registration agency? Kind of how is this done efficiently by publishers?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and the notion of DOIs as a kind of a status indicator is something that we work very closely with Crossref. We try our hardest to dispel this, and really internally for both organizations, we focus. The core of our work is on metadata and serving community needs and use cases. So that's really what we go to if. For example, if you are primarily a publisher and the types of information that you need to put in your metadata and the workflows that you use are more suited to, if those things are more suited to Crossref metadata, then that's the right place for you to go. On the DataCite side, we do, as I mentioned, we do register DOIs for text objects. We also register DOIs for all sorts of other types of resources. So if your needs are more so that you have a wide variety of materials that you need to register DOIs for, then DataCite might be the better choice. This is a question that comes up a lot with new organizations, new membership, and this is something that we go through with them in great detail and look at the types of objects they're registering DOIs for, and if it's not a good fit for DataCite, we send them to Crossref and vice versa. I will say there are organizations that register both Crossref and DataCite DOIs because they have multiple use cases and multiple needs that Crossref metadata supports some use cases and DataCite metadata supports other use cases. Yeah. It's all about the metadata, really.
It's all about the metadata. Yeah, and I posted this in the chat, it's worth mentioning. I wrote an article some years ago about the use of the investment that publishers should make in metadata as a marketing expense. You used to think of like, well, this book author wants to, a full page ad in this journal or this publication, which were always sort of dubious investments. investing in metadata and identifiers is sort of the marketing expense of the 21st century, and it is not dubious at all. It produces results.
It does, and I mean, I can't speak in great detail to exactly who comes through and collects data site metadata. I know it's the same for Crossref, but we have a huge amount of usage of our APIs from platforms and services that harvest metadata and process that metadata, make do all sorts of interesting things with that metadata. So we're not just talking about people and users consuming that metadata, but lots and lots of software and platforms coming through and consuming identifier metadata.
Oh yeah, and exactly as you were talking about the ecosystem, right? Of it hasn't yet been installed, but wouldn't it be great if we could just connect ORCIDs to ISBNs, and so that, and if an author wants to, populate their record with information about the book that they published, they didn't have to do that manually. You can just feed all of that data from the ISBN system or the, or the ORCID system or the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera systems. If someone is looking for information about a person because they read one book, well, here's the other books that that person read. Their ORCID record is probably one of the places they'd end up if they did a Google search.
Exactly. So, making those little hops across this, interconnected scholarly communication landscape is what we're looking toward enabling. So finding the other publications by an author, finding other authors they work with and are connected with, what's their research, what's their organization they're working with. So being able to easily navigate that interconnected network of people, places, and things in the scholarly communications universe.
Yeah. And in the spirit of interconnectedness, Jill made a good point. We'll collect all of the links that have been put into the presentations and the references, and we will put those on our event website, so you as participants can have easy access and can navigate that ecosystem easily. So Liz, thank you so much for your presentation and your talk.